Think about the last time you sent a message to someone you loved. Maybe it was a text, maybe an email. You typed it, hit send, and within seconds, sometimes less, it was there, on their screen, in their hands. You didn't think about how it got there. You didn't have to. Now take all of that away. No phone, no internet, no telegraph, no train, no car, no bicycle. Just paper, ink, a wax seal, and a man's legs. That's it. That's how you reached someone in Edo, Japan. And here's the thing that should stop you for a moment. It worked. Not just worked, it worked with a precision and a reliability that would embarrass some modern postal services. Letters traveled 500 kilometers in 10 days. Runners went through the night, through rain, through mountain passes in winter. They carried other people's words on their backs, and they ran. This is a story about one letter, where it came from, what it cost to send, who carried it, what almost stopped it, and what happened when it finally arrived. But before we get to the letter, we need to talk about the world it was sent from. Edo in the late 1700s was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most literate cities on earth. This is not a claim you will find in most Western history books, because Western history books tend to treat literacy as something that moved from Europe outward. The standard narrative goes, the printing press, the Reformation, the gradual spread of reading and writing through European society, eventually reaching the working classes by the 19th century. Meanwhile, the rest of the world waited. Japan was not waiting. The temple school system, Terracotta, had been spreading basic literacy through Edo's working population since the early 1600s. These were not elite institutions. They were neighborhood schools, often literally inside Buddhist temples, where children of craftsmen and merchants and laborers learned to read and write alongside the children of minor samurai. The curriculum was practical, reading contracts, writing letters, basic arithmetic, not philosophy, not literature. The skills a person needed to function in a commercial city. By the late 18th century, estimates suggest that the male literacy rate in Edo was somewhere between 60 and 70%. For women, lower, but not negligible. In London at the same period, the figure for working-class men was closer to 40%. In rural France, lower still. The person selling fish at Edo's morning market could read. The person repairing sandals could write. The woman running a small noodle stand could compose a letter to her sister in another city, and reasonably expect her sister to be able to read it. This matters for what comes next, because a postal system only works if people can write. And the reason Edo's postal system was extraordinary is that it was serving a population that had already decided, independently, that written communication was worth learning. The letter we're following was written by a man we'll call Takichi. He was 29 years old. He made paper screens, shoji screens, the translucent sliding panels that divided the rooms of Edo's wooden houses. It was skilled work, precise and time-consuming, and he was good at it. He had been good at it since his father taught him at 14. He lived in Ryogoku, the district by the river. His wife, Hana, had left 3 months earlier to care for her mother in Kyoto, who had fallen seriously ill. 3 months, 90 days of waking up in a room that had her absence in it like a physical thing. 90 days of the neighbor asking how she was doing, and him saying he didn't know, he hadn't heard. He had sent 2 letters already. He had received 1 back. The logistics of this communication, the cost, the waiting, the uncertainty, had become the texture of his daily life in a way he hadn't anticipated when she left. The 3rd letter was different. He wanted to tell her about the cherry blossom trees along the river, which were just beginning to bud. He wanted to tell her that her absence made the buds seem irritating rather than beautiful, which was not something he had planned to write, but which turned out to be true. He wanted to ask when she was coming home. He sat at his small desk in the evening, after the work was done, and he wrote. The paper was good paper. Not the best. Good paper was expensive. but not the cheapest either. He had decided, without quite articulating it to himself, that the quality of the paper mattered, that it was a way of saying, "This is not nothing. This took thought. This cost something." He wrote slowly. He was not a poor writer. The Terracotta had seen to that. But he wrote carefully, rereading each line before moving to the next. He described the buds. He described the neighbor who had taken to leaving food outside his door on evenings when he looked particularly depleted. He described the quality of light in the mornings now that spring was approaching. He did not write what he most wanted to write, which was simply, "Come home." He wrote around it instead, the way you do when you know the other person will understand without being told directly. He finished. He sealed the letter. He set it on the desk and looked at it for a while. Tomorrow he would take it to the Hikyaku. The Hikyaku was the postal agency, not a government institution, a private business, one of several operating the major routes between Japan's cities. The word Hikyaku meant, literally, flying legs, which told you something about how the service worked and how it saw itself. Takichi arrived at the agency the next morning before his workday started. The shop was already open. It had the particular atmosphere of a place that never fully closes, the sense that someone had been there all night and would be there all day and would still be there after he left. Behind the counter was a clerk who had seen enough letters to have lost all curiosity about them. He took Takichi's letter, weighed it in his hand, looked at the address. "Kyoto," he said. "Which service?" Takichi had thought about this. There were options. The standard 30-day service was the cheapest, reliable in the way that slow and cheap things are reliable. It would get there, eventually, without any particular promises about when. The 10-day service cost significantly more. It would be carried by relay runners, Hikyaku, passing the letter from station to station along the Tokaido Highway, with each runner covering his section at a run, day and night, until it reached its destination. The 6-day service was for people with money and urgency. The 4-day service, the Hayabikyaku, the Fast Express, was for merchants with contracts to close and lords with urgent business. The cost was equivalent, in modern terms, to tens of thousands of yen. A craftsman making screen panels did not use the 4-day service. 10 days, Takichi said. The clerk named the price. Takichi had expected it. He had sent letters before, but it still landed. It was roughly half a day's earnings for one letter, to travel 500 kilometers by human legs. He counted out the coins and placed them on the counter. The clerk took the letter and placed it in a wooden box with a dozen others. "It'll go out tomorrow morning from Shinagawa," the clerk said. 10 days to Kyoto, barring weather and the Oi River. Takichi nodded. The Oi River. He knew about the Oi River. Everyone who sent letters to the Kansai region knew about the Oi River. He thanked the clerk and left. The letter sat in the box overnight. Around it, in the same box, were other letters. A merchant's invoice, a mother's message to her son in Osaka, a letter from a government official that the clerk had handled with slightly more care than the others, for reasons he didn't explain, a love letter, judging by the quality of the paper and the smell of the ink, from someone who had spent more money than was strictly sensible, all of them waiting, all of them carrying something that mattered to someone. The next morning at the relay station in Shinagawa, the first station on the Tokaido Highway just south of Edo, a runner named Shinsuke picked up the box. He was 25 years old. He had been a Hikyaku for 5 years, which meant he had been running this route, or sections of it, for 5 years. His legs showed it. His calves were the kind of calves that develop only through sustained, repeated effort over years. The rest of him was lean in the way that people who expend enormous quantities of energy every day are lean. Not thin, but stripped down, nothing excess. He checked the box. He felt its weight. He assessed the sky. "Rain possible in the afternoon," the station keeper told him. "Watch the mountain passes." Shinsuke nodded. He already knew about the rain. He had a way of reading the sky that had become instinctive over 5 years of running in it. He shouldered the box and started running. The Tokaido Highway was one of the great roads of the Edo period, a carefully maintained route connecting Edo to Kyoto, dotted with 53 post towns, lined with tea houses and inns and vendors selling food and sandals, and the particular snacks associated with each region. It was also, depending on the season and the weather, one of the more challenging roads in Japan. It crossed mountains, it forded rivers. In summer it was hot and dusty. In winter it was cold and sometimes impassable. Shinsuke had run it in all conditions. He had run it with a twisted ankle. He had run it with a fever, once, which he did not recommend and would never admit to his station keeper. He had run it in a typhoon, reduced to a walk for part of that, which he also did not admit, and arrived at the next station with his hair plastered flat and his sandals destroyed. The box he carried was, in a sense, not his concern. His concern was his section of the road, Shinagawa to Kawasaki, roughly 10 kilometers. His job was to cover those 10 kilometers at speed, arrive at the Kawasaki relay station, and hand the box to the next runner. What was inside the box? Who had sent it? Who was waiting for it? None of that was technically his responsibility, but in practice it was. There is a thing that happens when you are responsible for carrying something that you know matters to people. You start to feel the weight of it differently. Not the physical weight, the other weight, the weight of the fact that somewhere, someone wrote these words and meant them, and somewhere else, someone is waiting for them. Shinsuke felt this every time. 5 years in, and he still felt it. Some runners stopped feeling it. He had worked with men who treated the box like cargo, like any other load to be moved from one point to another. He understood how that happened, but he hadn't gotten there himself. He ran. His sandals hit the packed earth of the highway in a rhythm he had found years ago and never abandoned, a pace that was faster than walking, slower than sprinting, sustainable over the distance he needed to cover. The box shifted slightly with each stride. He had learned to compensate for it without thinking. The first few kilometers were easy. Shinagawa faded behind him. The road opened up. The bay was visible to his right, gray and flat in the morning light. A farmer heading the other direction raised a hand. "Morning, Hikyaku." Shinsuke raised his hand back without slowing. He didn't have the breath to spare for words. He reached Kawasaki in just under 2 hours. His relief runner, a man named Gosuke, who was older and slower but whose section of the road was flatter, was waiting. They did the handoff. No ceremony, just the box passing from one set of hands to another, a brief exchange of information about road conditions. And then Gosuke was moving and Shinsuke was standing in the relay station doorway, breathing hard, watching the box disappear down the road. The station keeper handed him a cup of hot water. "Good run? Not bad. Sky looks wrong, though. Gosuke'll manage." Shinsuke drank the water. He looked at the sky again. The afternoon turned dark early. Rain started, first a drizzle, then something harder. Gosuke, by that point somewhere between Kawasaki and Kanagawa, pulled the box inside his jacket and kept running. The rain came through his jacket. The box didn't get wet because he was using his body as a shield, which meant his body got wet instead. He arrived at the Kanagawa relay station soaked through and smelling of wet cotton, and handed off the box without comment. The runner who took it at Kanagawa was drier than Gosuke had been. The runner after that was dry. By the time the box reached Fujisawa, the rain had moved inland, and the road was just damp rather than actively hostile. Inside the box, Takichi's letter was dry. It had not been touched by rain. It was moving southwest at a pace that in 1790 represented the absolute leading edge of what Japanese communications technology could achieve. The relay system, the post-horse relay, the Hikyaku network, was one of the functional marvels of the Edo period. It worked because it was built on a principle that is obvious in retrospect, but requires genuine organizational commitment to maintain. Short distances, full effort, reliable handoffs. No single runner covered the entire 500 kilometers. That would have been impossible, not because runners couldn't cover long distances, but because the quality of running would have degraded over the course of such a journey to the point where the speed advantage was lost. Instead, each runner covered 2 to 3 roughly 8 to 12 kilometers, at full effort. Then he handed off and rested, while the box continued with a fresh pair of legs. The result was that the box never tired. Individual humans tired. The box just kept moving. This was, functionally, a distributed system. Before anyone had words for distributed systems, before anyone had thought about logistics as a discipline, it was just. This is what works. Short legs, full effort, trusted handoffs. The trust part was not incidental. The entire system ran on the assumption that every runner in the chain would do their part. A letter sent on the 10-day service had to pass through approximately 40 to 50 relay stations. Each handoff was a moment where the chain could break. A runner who didn't show up, a station keeper who misfiled a box, a miscommunication about timing. The fact that most letters arrived within their promised window was a testament to the social infrastructure supporting the physical one. Communities along the Tokaido knew the Hikyaku. They watched for them. They made way for them on the road. A runner with a box had right of way. Not legally, there was no specific statute, but practically. People moved. Carts pulled aside. It was understood that the runner was carrying something that couldn't wait, and that waiting had a cost. On the fourth day, the box reached the mountain section west of Mishima. This was where things got harder. The runner assigned to the Mishima section, a man in his early 30s named Kizaburo, looked at the sky with the specific displeasure of someone who had been reading mountain weather for years and didn't like what he was reading. The rain that had hit the coastal section 2 days ago had moved inland and intensified. The mountain passes were wet. The paths were slick. This was not ideal for running with a box on your back. Kizaburo ran anyway. The first hour was manageable, wet but not dangerous. The second hour was harder. The path narrowed as it climbed, and the rain had turned the packed earth to something closer to clay. His sandals, which had been adequate for the coastal road, were not quite adequate for this. He slipped twice, caught himself both times. The box stayed dry because he had wrapped it in oilcloth before leaving the station. A precaution the station keeper had pressed on him with more emphasis than usual. If the letters get wet, the station keeper had said, "Don't come back." He had been joking, mostly. Kizaburo was not thinking about the letters in the abstract. He was thinking about his footing. He was thinking about the gap between his current position and the next station, which was 3 rai away and downhill, and whether the downhill was going to be more or less treacherous than the uphill had been. He crested the pass and started down. Downhill in rain on a mountain path is its own specific category of unpleasant. Gravity helps with speed and creates complications with control. Kizaburo slowed his pace from a run to something between a run and a careful walk, which was galling, because it meant he was going to be late to the next station, which meant the letter was going to be behind schedule. He made it. He arrived at the station muddy, wet, and 20 minutes behind his expected time. He handed off the box. The next runner looked at him. Mountains bad? Bad enough. Watch the left path after the second marker. There's a section where the drainage has gone. Noted. Thanks. The box continued. Day 6. The box was in the middle section, between the mountains and the Oi River. The weather had cleared. The roads were drying. The relay was running smoothly. Clean handoffs, good pace, no delays. Inside the box, alongside Takichi's letter, was a merchant's invoice that had already been overtaken by events. The deal it referenced had closed 2 days ago, and the love letter, which was still sealed and still smelling faintly of whatever the sender had used to scent the paper. The runner carrying the box at this point was a teenager named Matsujiro, 17 years old, in his first month on the route. He ran with the particular energy of someone who hasn't yet learned to ration themselves over a long career. He was fast. He would be slightly less fast in 5 years, but more consistent. He was thinking about the box in a way that older runners sometimes stopped thinking about it, with genuine awareness of what it contained. Other people's words, other people's urgency, other people's ordinary and extraordinary needs, all of them reduced to paper and ink and the speed of his legs. He ran faster. He arrived at the next station 4 minutes ahead of schedule, which earned him a look of mild surprise from the station keeper and a comment about not burning out before he was 20. The box went on. Day 7 brought the Oi River. This is the moment in every letter's journey from Edo to Kyoto that was most likely to cause a problem. The Oi River was, in the vocabulary of the Tokaido, the difficult one. It was wide, fast-moving, and prone to flooding after rain. And unlike most of Japan's rivers, the Oi had no bridge. This was not an oversight. It was deliberate policy. The shogunate had decided, for military reasons, that bridges across the Oi would make it too easy for armies to move quickly toward Edo in the event of a revolt. No bridge meant any military force had to ford the river, which took time, which bought the capital time to prepare. The side effect of this policy was that tens of thousands of ordinary people, every year, had to find a way across a wide and unpredictable river with no bridge. The solution was human infrastructure. At the river's edge were men whose job was to carry travelers across, shoulder carriers for those who could pay, human chains for lighter loads, and for the Hikyaku boxes, a specific protocol. The box went across in a waterproofed container, carried by a man who knew the river's moods and had been crossing it for years. On day 7, the river was high, not impassably high. That threshold was still a foot of water away, but high enough that the crossing men were charging extra and moving more carefully than usual. The runner who arrived at the east bank with the box was a man named Shohei. He looked at the river and then looked at the crossing man. How long? Hour, maybe. River's moving fast. We go careful. The 10-day promise is already tight. I know. But if we rush and someone drops the box in the river, your 10 days don't matter much. Shohei conceded the point. They crossed carefully. The box was passed hand to hand across the current, staying above the waterline. It took an hour and 10 minutes. The box arrived on the west bank dry. Shohei handed it to the waiting runner on the Kyoto side. River was slow, I heard. Weather? Clearing. Should be clean from here. The box went on. Day 8. The box was west of the Oi, moving through flatter country. The pace was good. The weather was clear. The relay was running smoothly again. Day 9. The outskirts of Kyoto, the landscape changing from highway farmland to the denser, older urban fabric of Japan's ancient capital. Smaller streets. More foot traffic. The particular smell of a city with a longer history than Edo's. Older wood, older stone, the persistent fragrance of incense from temples that had been standing for centuries. The runner on the final leg was a man named Shokichi. He was 43 years old and had been running the Kyoto end of the route for 15 years. He knew the streets. He knew which alleys to take to avoid the morning market crowds. He knew which neighborhoods were confusing to outsiders and which residents could be trusted to give accurate directions. He checked the address on each letter as he removed it from the box. Most he could place immediately. A few required asking. Takichi's letter to Hana, a residential address in a neighborhood of small tradespeople, northwest of the city center. He found the street. He found the house. He knocked. Hana was 31 years old. She had been in Kyoto for 3 months, sleeping in the small room next to her mother's, waking twice in the night to check that her mother was still breathing steadily, cooking small, careful meals and watching her mother eat them, gauging recovery by increments too small to see on any given day but visible when you compared this week to last month. She was tired. Not dramatically tired, not the kind of tired that makes a good story. Just the ordinary accumulated fatigue of someone who had been doing something emotionally and physically demanding for a long time with no particular end in sight. When the knock came, she was in the middle of washing rice. She dried her hands. She went to the door. The runner introduced himself. "Letter from Edo," he said. She took it. The paper was heavier than she expected. Takichi had used good paper. She could feel the quality of it in her hands. The seal was intact. The address was in his handwriting, which she would have recognized anywhere, in any context, even if there had been no name attached. She thanked the runner. She noticed that he seemed to want to say something else. She had a sense of being seen, the way you sometimes feel when a stranger recognizes that something matters to you. He gave a small bow and left. She went inside. Her mother was asleep. The house was quiet. She sat at the table and opened the letter. His handwriting inside was the same as always, not elegant, but careful. He had pressed slightly harder than usual on certain characters, which was what he did when he was being deliberate about something. She had learned to read the pressure of his writing, the way some people learn to read tone of voice. He had written about the buds on the cherry trees. He had written about the neighbor, the one who kept leaving food, which made her smile because she had asked the neighbor to do that, and evidently hadn't mentioned it to Takichi. He had written about the quality of the light, and at the end, in the slightly smaller handwriting he used when he was saying something he wasn't quite sure how to say directly, "When the cherry blossoms come, let's see them together." She put the letter down. Then she picked it up again and read it from the beginning. The letter had traveled 500 kilometers. 8 relay runners, by her estimate. She had learned something about how the system worked from Takichi's explanations before she left. 8 runners, carrying it through mountain rain and river crossings and whatever else the road had offered over 10 days. All of it so that she could sit at a table in a quiet house and read his handwriting and feel, briefly, less far away from him. She sat there for a while. Outside, a neighbor's child was playing. The light through the paper screen was the afternoon light of early spring. Then she got up and found her writing kit. The return letter took her 2 days to write, not because she was slow, because she kept stopping. She wrote about her mother, who was improving in a way that felt real now, rather than just hoped for. She wrote about the city, which she had never lived in before, and which felt ancient in a way that Edo, for all its size, didn't quite manage. She wrote about the smell of the incense from the temple at the end of the street, which was different from the incense she was used to, and which she had come to associate with this particular period of her life. Her mother's illness, the small room, the waiting. She wrote, "I think I'll be home by next month. Wait for me." She did not write what she most wanted to write, which was the same thing he had not written, just, "I miss you." She wrote around it the same way he had. They had been married long enough to communicate in the spaces between what was said. She sealed the letter and took it to the nearest postal agency. She paid the 10-day rate. She watched the clerk take it and put it in the box. The box was going east. 2 weeks after Takichi sent his letter, he received hers. He had been watching the calendar. He had been, without quite admitting it to himself, doing calculations in his head every day. Day 1, she receives it. Day 2, she reads it again. Day 3, she starts writing back. Day 5, she sends the reply. Day 10, it arrives here, adjusting the calculations when the weather reports suggested complications, revising upward when someone mentioned the oi was running high. The letter arrived 11 days after she had sent it. He opened it at his desk in the evening with the lamp lit. The same position in which he had written to her. The desk, the lamp, the quiet house. Mirror image. Her handwriting was immediately visible inside. He knew it as well as his own. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and added it to the small box where he kept her previous letters. There were 4 now. He stacked the new one on top of the others. From the next room, his neighbor called through the wall. Letter from Hana? Yes. Good news? She's coming home next month. A pause. Then, well, it's about time. He agreed. He sat at the desk for a while longer, the lamp burning, the letter in its box. It was a piece of paper, one side written on, the other blank. Ink on paper, nothing more than that. But ink on paper, carried by 8 people across 500 kilometers of mountain and highway and river, was not nothing. It was the entire technology of human connection available to him in 1790. It was the best the world could do, and it was enough. Let's step back from Takichi and Hana for a moment and look at what the Hikyaku system actually was, at scale. At its peak in the late Edo period, the relay postal network covered the major routes between Japan's cities with a density and reliability that contemporary observers found remarkable. The Tokaido alone, the highway between Edo and Kyoto, had 53 relay stations. Each station was staffed, supplied, and maintained as part of the commercial infrastructure of the town it sat in. Station keepers knew the runners by name. Runners knew which station keepers could be trusted to have the next man ready at the right time. The system was private. Multiple competing agencies operated the major routes, which created pressure to deliver on promised timescales. Your reputation depended on your letters arriving when you said they would. A 10-day letter that regularly arrived in 12 days was a 10-day letter that people stopped buying. And people did buy them. Extensively. The volume of correspondence moving through Edo's postal system in the 18th century was, for the era, extraordinary. It was driven by commerce. Merchant networks depended on fast communication to coordinate purchases, prices, and shipments, but it was also driven by the simple human need to reach across distance and touch someone. A city full of literate people is a city full of people who want to write to each other. The Terracotta schools had created a population with the skills to communicate. The Hikyaku system had created the infrastructure to do it. The result was a correspondence culture that produced, over the Edo period, an enormous quantity of letters. Most of them ordinary, most of them lost, all of them evidence of people trying to stay connected across a world that moved only as fast as a man could run. There is one more thing worth saying about the Oi River. The no-bridge policy that made the Oi crossing such a recurring complication for letter carriers was, from a certain angle, a perfect encapsulation of the Edo period's relationship with connectivity. The shogunate was simultaneously building and constraining it. Roads were maintained, relay systems were licensed and regulated, commerce was facilitated, and the most important river crossing on the most important highway had no bridge, deliberately, because connectivity in the wrong circumstances was a threat. This tension between connection and control, between the utility of communication and the danger of too much communication too quickly, is not unique to Edo, Japan. Every society that has developed better communication infrastructure has immediately had to grapple with the question of who gets to use it and how fast it can move. The shogunate's answer at the Oi River was, everyone crosses slowly. Everyone waits when the water rises. The Lord's armies are delayed. So are the love letters. In practice, the love letters and the merchants' invoices got across anyway, by human ingenuity and the simple fact that people who needed to communicate would find a way to do it. The river delayed them. It didn't stop them. It never stops them. There's a detail in the way Hikyaku runners were described by their contemporaries that I think is worth holding on to. They were not celebrated the way, say, a sumo wrestler was celebrated. There were no woodblock prints of them, no ranking sheets, no crowds. They were part of the infrastructure of daily life in the way that reliable infrastructure always is, invisible until it fails, taken for granted when it works. But there are accounts, scattered through the literature and records of the period, of the specific social status the runners occupied in their communities. They were known by name in every town along their route. When a runner came through, people made way, not out of legal requirement, but out of the recognition that he was carrying something that couldn't wait, and that the thing he was carrying mattered to someone. A farmer in a field along the Tokaido, watching a runner pass, knew that the box on the runner's back contained letters. He probably knew, roughly, what kinds of letters. A merchant's business, a family's news, someone's urgent need to say something to someone far away. He couldn't know whose, but he knew the weight of it in the abstract, and that was enough to step aside. Takichi kept all 4 of Hana's letters in the small box on his desk. He kept them for years after she came home. Long after the information in them was outdated, her mother recovered, she came back in the month she predicted, life resumed. He kept them. When she found them once, years later, she asked why. He said he wasn't sure, that they felt important to keep, that they were evidence of something. Evidence of what? She asked. He thought about it. That we tried, he said, that when there was nothing else, no way to reach each other, no way to know. We tried anyway. We paid the money and we gave the paper to the runner and we waited. And it worked. She didn't say anything for a moment. It didn't always work, she said. The second letter I sent, you told me it arrived damaged. The ink was smeared on the last page. He nodded. He remembered. He had been able to read most of it, not all, but enough, he said. She looked at the box. Yes, she said, enough. In 1871, the Meiji government established Japan's modern postal service. Uniform rates, government operation, infrastructure that reached beyond the major highways to the smaller roads and the rural communities that the Hikyaku network had never fully served. The private relay system faded. The runners retired or found other work. The relay stations became ordinary buildings with other uses. The specific knowledge of the route, which paths were passable in rain, which river crossings were reliable, where to stop for water, how to pace yourself over the mountain section. All of that accumulated expertise dispersed into private memory and eventually disappeared. What the new system gained in coverage and affordability, it lost in the particular quality that the Hikyaku had. The feeling that a specific person had carried your words and taken personal responsibility for their arrival. The modern post was better in almost every measurable way. It was also more abstract. This is not a complaint. It's an observation. Every advance in communication infrastructure trades something personal for something scalable. The telegraph was faster than the Hikyaku, but you couldn't put a cherry blossom metaphor in a telegram. The telephone was faster than a letter, but you couldn't keep a phone call in a box on your desk for 30 years. The thing that Takichi and Hana had, the slow, expensive, uncertain, rain-delayed, river-blocked, 8-runner, 10-day system, was already nearly gone by the time their grandchildren were grown. And their grandchildren didn't miss it because they had something better. But somewhere in the archives, there are letters from the Edo period, thousands of them. Ordinary people's words, preserved on paper that was made to last. Letters about sick mothers and cherry blossoms, and the particular quality of evening light when someone you love is far away. All of them traveled 500 kilometers on a man's legs. All of them arrived. Most of them were enough. Before we follow the letter out of Edo, it's worth spending a moment in the room where it was written, because the act of writing a letter in 1790 was different from anything we do today in ways that go beyond the obvious. When Takichi sat down at his desk with paper and brush and ink, he was making a series of decisions that modern communication has made invisible. First, the paper. Paper in Edo was not a commodity in the way it is now. It was manufactured by hand, by specialists, in grades that reflected both quality and purpose. The cheapest paper, the kind used for rough notes and practice, was thin, slightly rough, and didn't hold ink cleanly. The best paper was thick, smooth, and took ink the way skin takes a tattoo, deeply, permanently, with clarity. Between those extremes were gradations that any literate Edo resident could distinguish at a glance. Choosing paper for a letter was a statement. Not a dramatic one, not something anyone would comment on directly, but legible to anyone who understood the code. You used cheap paper for things that didn't matter. You used good paper for things that did. The paper itself communicated something before a single character was read. Second, the brush and ink. In a culture where writing was done with a brush rather than a pen, the physical act of writing was more variable, more personal, more subject to the conditions of the moment. A pen produces roughly consistent lines regardless of how you're feeling. A brush responds to pressure, angle, speed, and the particular state of your hand and mind at the moment of writing. Experienced readers of the period could assess the emotional state of a letter's author from the quality of the brushwork. Not always accurately. People could write carefully even when distressed, and loosely even when calm. But the information was there, encoded in the strokes. A letter written in a hurry looked different from a letter written with deliberate care. A letter written by someone who had been crying was sometimes visible as exactly that. Takichi wrote carefully. Hana would know he had written carefully. That was also part of the message. Third, the seal. Before the letter went into the postal system, it had to be sealed. Not to protect its contents from physical exposure, though that mattered, but as a statement of completion and intent. An unsealed letter was not finished. A sealed letter was a commitment. I have said what I mean to say. I am sending this. I am ready for it to go. Breaking a seal was not done casually. When Hana received the letter and opened it, she was completing an act that Takichi had begun. The seal was the last thing his hands had touched before she touched it first. This was understood. It gave the physical letter a quality that a digital message doesn't have. It had passed through hands. It had been carried by a body. It existed in space and time in a way that could be felt. The Hikyaku runners operated within a social world that is worth understanding a little more fully. They were not samurai. They were not merchants. In Edo's formal social hierarchy, they occupied a somewhat ambiguous position. They were service workers, which put them below the artisan class that Takichi belonged to. But their work gave them a mobility and a visibility that most people below their formal rank didn't have. They traveled. They knew roads. They had relationships with station keepers and innkeepers and tea-house owners across hundreds of kilometers of Japan. This mobility was unusual. Most people in Edo, Japan, lived and died within a relatively small geographic area. Travel for pleasure was not impossible. The pilgrimage system gave people a sanctioned reason to move across the country. But the routine mobility that the Hikyaku runners had was genuinely rare. They had seen things that most people only heard about. The mountains west of Edo, the particular way the light fell over the bay at Shimizu, the streets of Kyoto, which were old in a way that Edo, for all its size, wasn't. This knowledge gave them a certain authority. When a Hikyaku runner described road conditions or weather in a distant region, people listened. Not because runners were formally important, but because they were the people who had actually been there and could tell you what it was like. They were also, in a functional sense, the news network of their era. Not formally, they didn't carry newspapers or official announcements along with the private letters. But information moved with them. A runner coming into a relay station from the east brought in his conversation and his observations, some sense of what the world looked like 50 kilometers back. Multiply this across a network of hundreds of runners on dozens of routes, and you get something that functioned like a slow, informal, human-powered information system. It was not fast enough to break news in the way that modern communications can, but it was fast enough to create a shared sense of what was happening in different parts of the country, moving at the pace of running legs and passing from person to person at each relay station. There is a question that comes up when people learn about the Hikyaku system, and it's worth addressing directly. How reliable was it really? The honest answer is impressively reliable, with specific and predictable failure modes. The specific failure modes were weather and water. Heavy rain slowed mountain runners significantly and occasionally made passes impassable. River flooding, particularly the Oi, could delay letters by 2 or 3 days with no warning. Summer typhoons could shut down sections of the route entirely. But within the normal range of conditions, the 70 or 80% of the year when the weather was merely difficult rather than extraordinary, the system delivered on its promises with a consistency that was, for the era, genuinely remarkable. Part of this was structural. The relay system meant that no single point of failure could stop a letter. If one runner was sick, the station kept another. If one path was blocked, there was usually an alternative. The redundancy was built in, not through formal design, but through the accumulated problem-solving of people who had been running these routes for generations. Part of it was cultural. The Hikyaku runners had a professional identity built around reliability. Being the person who let a letter down, who lost it, damaged it, delayed it beyond the promised window, was not just a job failure. It was a personal one. The box contained other people's needs. You were responsible for other people's needs. That was the job. This sense of personal responsibility for abstract cargo is not universal. It has to be cultivated. The Hikyaku culture cultivated it deliberately through the language used to describe the work, through the stories passed down about runners who had gone extraordinary lengths to deliver on time, through the visible and daily reminder that what was in the box mattered to someone you would never meet. The station keeper at Shinagawa told Shinsuke, "One by one, these letters have a life in them." He said it every time a new batch came in. He had been saying it for 20 years. Most runners heard it often enough that it became background noise. Some of them, Shinsuke among them, heard it every time. Let's talk about cost. The 10-day service that Takichi used cost him roughly half a day's earnings. This was not unusual. It was the standard price for reliable correspondence between major cities. It was also, by any reasonable measure, a significant expenditure for a working craftsman. Why did people pay it? The simple answer is, because the alternative was not communicating at all. There was no cheaper, reliable option. The 30-day service was cheaper but so slow that by the time a letter arrived, the situation it described had often already resolved. Illness improved or worsened, business opportunities closed, the moment passed. For anything time-sensitive, you paid for speed. But the payment also carried meaning beyond its practical function. When Takichi counted out coins and placed them on the counter, he was making a statement about value. Not to the clerk, who didn't care. To himself. This cost something. This was worth the cost. Hana is worth this. The act of paying for communication is something we have largely lost. Modern messaging costs nothing in any direct individual sense. The costs are distributed, abstracted, invisible, which means the act of sending a message carries none of the weight of the decision to spend money on it. This is not an argument for expensive communication. It's an observation about what disappears when friction disappears. When reaching someone costs nothing, the act of reaching them carries less weight. Not no weight, but less. Takichi, counting out his coins, was not thinking about the philosophy of communication economics. He was thinking about Hana, but the coins he counted were a form of proof, to himself, and eventually to her, that this mattered enough to pay for. The cherry blossoms came, as they always do, in early spring. Hana came home in the same week. She had written to say she would be there by the end of the month, and she was, arriving on an afternoon when the trees along the river were at their peak. The brief, slightly surreal moment when the blossoms are fully open and the petals have not yet started to fall. Takichi had gone to work that morning not knowing if today was the day. He came home in the evening and she was there. She had let herself in with the key she still had. She was cooking something. The smell reached him at the door. They went to see the blossoms that evening. Not the grand viewing parties with food and sake that wealthier families organized. Just the two of them, walking along the river in the last light, the petals falling around them in a way that was beautiful and slightly absurd, and very precisely what the letters had promised. It is easy to sentimentalize this. The letters, the waiting, the reunion under the blossoms. It arranges itself into a story that wants to be told in a particular key. But the thing that actually matters is not the sentiment. It is the fact that the communication worked, that across 500 kilometers and 3 months and 8 runners and 1 flooded river and mountain rain, 2 people managed to stay connected, to maintain something, to arrive at the evening under the cherry trees still knowing each other. The letter was not the relationship. The relationship was the relationship. But the letters held it in place, while the distance threatened to dissolve it. That is what communication infrastructure does, at its best. Not create connection, people create connection. Just hold it steady while the distance tries to win. The distance didn't win. There is a kind of history that asks, what was it like to live then, in that particular time and place, with those particular constraints? It is not always a comfortable question. The Edo period had severe constraints on movement, on social mobility, on expression, on the lives of women in ways that the story of Hana, who couldn't leave Kyoto because her mother needed her and couldn't know when she would come home, hints at without fully addressing. But within those constraints, people found ways to reach each other. The Hikyaku system was not designed to be beautiful or meaningful. It was designed to be reliable and profitable. It became meaningful because people used it for meaningful things, because love letters and worried questions and small domestic details and promises about cherry blossoms filled the boxes alongside the merchants' invoices. The runners who carried those boxes did not know which was which. They ran with all of it. They ran in the rain and across the flooding rivers and over the mountain passes and through the nights, and they handed off and rested, and the next runner picked it up and ran. The letter arrived. It was enough. In a museum in Tokyo, there are Edo period letters. Most visitors walk past them quickly. They are, on the surface, not spectacular objects. Small pieces of paper, covered in brushwork that requires reading knowledge to parse and historical context to fully understand. But if you stop and look at them, what you are looking at is someone's attempt to cross a distance, 500 kilometers, or 100, or 30. Some crisis of separation, illness, business, the ordinary movements of a life that kept taking people away from each other. Each letter was carried by a person, probably multiple people. Each of those people took responsibility for getting it there. Each of them ran. What is in the letters varies. What is constant is the effort. The paper chosen carefully, the brush lifted, pressed, moved, the seal placed, the coins counted, the weight. And somewhere on the other end, someone opening it, reading it twice, feeling briefly less far away.